Get started. So again, welcome on behalf of the Clements Center for National Security, Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and UT's Intelligence Studies Project. We're excited today by the opportunity to hear from Professor Amy Zegart about her new book on the history and future of American intelligence. But before we formally introduce Professor Zegart, invite her to describe her work, we have a special guest convener with us today. It's good fortune would have it. Our colleagues at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at UT are in the process of welcoming to Austin a new dean, J.R. DeShazo. Dean DeShazo asked to say a word of welcome to our guest. Dean, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Steve. Amy, welcome to Austin virtually. We're delighted to have you. For those of you who don't know, Amy and I have known each other probably almost 25 years now, back when I had hair. We were both assistant professors, among the very first that UCLA hired when they started their School of Public Affairs. And I remember Amy's first book, it was called Flawed by Design, had a big impact on me intellectually. She kind of traced the effects of politics on the original design and then evolution of intelligence agencies like the CIA, the National Security Council, and others. And, you know, I got really excited as a result about this field in political science that focuses on the politics of bureaucratic structure, and really helped me think about, you know, when agencies succeed and when they fail, what role politics plays in that. You know, I can't think of anyone certainly in the social science world that has had more of a contribution to trying to enhance the design and the performance of our intelligence agencies than Amy has in her long and distinguished career. So we're lucky to get to hear from her today. I know, Amy, in your book, one of your concerns is the lack of a place for students to understand how innovations in spying, espionage, and intelligence have evolved over time, and really grapple with the challenges that we face today in the digital age. I think you know this, but I want the audience to know that UT and LBJ School in particular, we're trying to do our part in creating a really first-rate learning environment for exactly that focus. I believe we're one of the very few universities that has a CIA analyst in residence. I hear from unclassified sources that we are #2 in the country in supplying the CIA with recruits. When I arrived 6 months ago, I was delighted to find that we had 11 faculty, full-time tenured and professional track faculty who focused on intelligence and intelligence studies. And a lot of our strength, I think, is due to the leadership of folks who are in the room with us today, people like Willem Bowden and Bobby Chesney, Steve, who you all just heard from, Paul Pope, and recently Sheena has joined us and helped start this year the Asian Policy Program. So I want to thank them for their leadership. And Amy, you know, in light of that, you are going to have such a receptive audience today as you talk about your new book. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope that in your next visit, we can make it in person here in Austin, and after your talk, we can go out to lunch, maybe down at Lake Austin. Thank you all for being here. Steve, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dean, for those kind words. We appreciate all the support you've provided, and welcome to Austin. So I'll quickly introduce Professor Zegart. Then we've asked her to provide an overview of several of the main themes that she addresses in Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. Unlike many of you who've not yet received your copy, I had the opportunity to read a version of the book several weeks ago. Unsurprisingly, I found it engaging and provocative. So I'll have a few questions to pose to Professor Zegart. Then she's agreed to field your questions until our time expires. So please do drop your questions into the Q&A folder, where my colleague Karen Doherty will keep them organized for me, and I'll do my best to deliver them faithfully. So Amy Zegart's a familiar and widely respected teacher, scholar, author, and public commentator on American intelligence. She's been studying our intelligence enterprise for different vantage points for more than 30 years. So her views on the performance, challenges, and controversies that inevitably surround our intelligence agencies are treated quite seriously and they have an impact. Dr. Zegart is currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of political science at Stanford. She's a past co-director of Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Our guest is the author of 5 previous books, including Spying Blind, as well as Flawed by Design that Dean DeShazo mentioned. Spying Blind is one that I found particularly useful. It assesses the institutional factors that contributed to the success of the 9/11 attacks. We're pleased that Professor Zegart has been a regular visitor to Austin and has consistently supported our national security programs. So over 10 chapters in Spies and Lies, Algorithms, Professor Zegart describes the historical antecedents of U.S. intelligence, milestones in the performance of our intelligence agencies, both successes and failures. And finally, she maps out several daunting challenges that currently face the intelligence agencies. Most important, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms advances the view that intelligence matters in keeping our country safe, and that an informed public debate is a vital component for long-term intelligence success. So with that, Amy, we're anxious to hear from you. Welcome.
Well, man, Texans know how to give a girl a good welcome. This is just so great to be with you, Steve and JR. You guys have amassed the dream team at the LBJ school. So I know Dean DeShazo has to leave early, but I can't resist saying just a word or two. What a tremendous colleague he was when we were both starting out at UCLA. He talked about how I influenced him. He influenced me too. And he also gave me incredible tutorials in statistics. So it's never too late to ask a friend for help when it comes to learning new methods. So I'm delighted that he's in Austin, and I'm delighted to be with the Intelligence Studies Dream Team at UT. And what an amazing job you're doing running this program. Thank you so much for having me. And for sure, I'm taking you up on the deal to have real barbecue in person when I come to Austin next. So, and let me say, Steve, just a minute too. I want to thank you for reading earlier chapters. So those of you who read the book and you like what you read, particularly in the covert action chapter, you have Professor Slick to thank for helping me work through some of those issues. The things you don't like or the things that are wrong are all on me, not on him. So I want to emphasize that too. So there's nothing like a good colleague giving you tough criticism in earlier versions of your work to make it better. So I really want to thank you for that. So you asked me to give a little bit of a scene setter for our discussion about the book. And what I want to do, what I thought would be helpful is to start with what I think are 2 provocative and disturbing discoveries that I found in researching the book. And the first is that there are more congressional experts in powdered milk than intelligence today, right? That's true. So there are more members of the Congressional Dairy Caucus than there are members who have previously worked, for example, in an intelligence agency before. And that's because members from dairy states have a huge incentive to learn the business before they ever walk in the door of Congress, but there's no dairy state equivalent for intelligence. That's one of the reasons why there's so little expertise in Congress engaged in congressional oversight. So that's concerning discovery number 1. Concerning discovery number 2, more of the top 25 universities ranked by US News and World Report offer courses on the history of rock and roll than US intelligence. Now, UT is a huge outlier here, and it's a really important one, but most top universities actually don't teach any courses about US intelligence. And so that means, as I tell my own students here at Stanford, they have a better chance of learning about U2 the rock band rather than U2 the spy plane. So we have an education crisis when it comes to intelligence in this country. Most people know intelligence is important, but they don't know how intelligence works. And one of the things that I found in the book is that people get a lot of their information about intelligence, erroneous information, from spy-themed entertainment. So I track the rise of spy-themed entertainment, and I find not only in my public opinion polling that it is affecting real public opinion attitudes towards intelligence issues, but it's also affecting how policymakers think about intelligence challenges. And just one sort of data point to emphasize how much I think spy-themed entertainment isn't just entertainment. As this crowd probably knows, when the movie Zero Dark 30 came out, Zero Dark 30 depicting the 10-year hunt for Osama bin Laden, that movie was portrayed as a reported film, as more of a documentary than a work of fiction. But it was, in fact, a work of fiction. It was so confusing when the movie came out that the acting director of the CIA at the time, Michael Morrell, had to issue a memo to the CIA's workforce emphasizing what was true and what wasn't, and that the movie was an unrealistic portrayal of the facts. So when the head of the CIA has to tell the CIA workforce that a fictional film about the CIA is actually not realistic, you know, entertainment isn't just entertainment. So I wrote this book originally to help fill this education gap. I want to teach this class. I want to teach the book in a class, and I'm teaching a new class based on the book at Stanford in the spring quarter. But I started off writing a different book than I ended up writing. I started off wanting to write Intelligence 101. So Professor Slick went through some of the chapters that I have in the book, but I ended up writing Intelligence 2.0. What do I mean by that? So the book does cover various chapters like, why do all presidents use covert action, even though it so often fails? Why is congressional oversight always so problematic? Some basic chapters like that. What is counterintelligence? How do we think about cyber threats? But one of the benefits of taking so long to finish a book, in this case I did, is that the world changed. And what changed fundamentally was the role of emerging technologies. And so Intelligence 2.0, the sort of second mission of writing this book, is taking a much closer look at how a whole host of emerging technologies are challenging every aspect of the intelligence enterprise. And so I want to take a few more minutes to give you a sense of where I come down on this 2.0 piece. What do I mean by emerging technologies? I think we live in a moment of convergence. We've had emerging technologies before, but never so many changing so much so fast. So think about the internet, think about social media, think about cell phone connectivity, think about artificial intelligence, think about quantum computing, synthetic biology, the commercial satellite revolution, right? With thousands of commercial satellites offering incredible imagery and other types of analysis available to people for free or at low cost. The convergence of these and other technologies is creating what I believe is an adapt or fail moment for our intelligence community. And together, this convergence of emerging technologies is driving what I call the 5 mores for US intelligence agencies, right? It's not just a list of technologies and not just a list of threats, but I think taken together, they're driving 5 key challenges for intelligence. And I call them the 5 mores. The first more is more threats. Technology is enabling different actors to threaten across vast distances in a way that they haven't been able to do before in cyberspace, for example. So we know for almost all of American history until now, 2 things provided security above all: power and geography. Countries, right, with the most powerful militaries were generally better protected against their adversaries. And in addition to that, the United States had the benefit of good geography, vast oceans separating us from dangerous neighborhoods and good neighbors to the north and to the south. But those 2 things are not true in cyberspace, right? Power and vulnerability in cyberspace go hand in hand. The United States is one of the most powerful countries in cyberspace today, but we're also the most vulnerable because we're so digitally connected, and because our freedom of speech enables adversaries to deceive, injecting information warfare at scale. And geography doesn't protect us in cyberspace either. Our good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods are all intertwined when it comes to cyberspace. So we have more threats driven by technology that the intelligence community needs to deal with. The second more is more speed. Intelligence, as this crowd knows well, has to move at the speed of relevance for decision makers. And that speed is accelerating. So it used to be, if you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The time from that first YouTube photograph that showed Soviet installations in Cuba to the time that President Kennedy had to say something about it, he had to distill the intelligence, assess what it meant, and formulate policy. That time was 13 days. You fast forward to 9/11, President Bush had 13 hours from the time of the first terrorist attack to the time that night that he delivered his policy response, in between trying to assess the intelligence. Now, thanks to cyber threats, we have maybe 13 minutes or 13 seconds, or maybe it's too late because cyber breaches are often discovered weeks, if not months, after they've already penetrated our systems. So intelligence has to move at a much faster pace than it has before to keep pace with other sources of information that policymakers have today. So we have more threats, more speed. The third more is more data. All of us are drowning in data today, and intelligence officers are no exception. There are more people today on the planet that have cell phones than running water. Right? Connectivity is everywhere. More than half the world is online. The amount of data on Earth is estimated to double every 2 years. It's an astounding amount of data. And if intelligence is the business of generating insight by finding needles in haystacks, now we know that the haystacks are growing out of control, and our intelligence officers need help to mine this growing array of data for insight faster and better than adversaries to deliver that decision advantage that they're in the business of doing. So more threats, more speed, more data. The fourth more is more customers. Intelligence isn't just for people with security clearances anymore. People outside the US government now also need intelligence to keep the country safe and to advance the national interest. Think about voters who need intelligence about foreign election interference. In fact, intelligence agencies are now starting to issue public service announcements about foreign election interference in elections. So when the National Security Agency Director, General Nakasone, is making public service announcements, right, about intelligence threats to your vote, you know times are changing. Tech leaders also need intelligence about threats to and through their systems. Critical infrastructure leaders in sectors from financial services to power and water also need intelligence in order to protect their organizations and these vital areas of critical infrastructure to the nation. So the customer piece is really changing. And what that means is that our intelligence community has to increasingly produce for the open, not just the classified world. And that's a fundamental shift in what they need to do and who they need to serve. So that's more customers. The fifth more, and perhaps from a political science standpoint, one of the most interesting mores, more competitors in the intelligence arena. Thanks to all of this connectivity, intelligence isn't just for governments anymore. This open source world, a world of publicly available data, has given rise to new collectors, new analysts, new capabilities that don't require superpower levels of intelligence agencies to gain insight and decision advantage. So if you think back on Russia's last invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the most valuable intelligence related to that invasion came from selfies, not secrets, right? Russian soldiers taking photographs of themselves and posting those photographs on social media for their family and friends, with Ukrainian highway signs in the background and timestamps on those photographs. So we see, and I have a chapter in the book dedicated to citizen nuclear sleuths today. This is a new ecosystem of folks, including my colleagues here at Stanford that work in the open source world, and hobbyists and activists and journalists and others that are all trying to mine open source or publicly available information for insight about the most secretive of threats, illicit nuclear activities. And what I find in this chapter is that there are real benefits to this emerging world, but there are also real risks to this emerging world. And we can talk about that if you want in our discussion. But the upshot of the Intelligence 2.0 part of the book that I want to get across is that these five mores, right? More threats, more speed, more data, more customers, more competitors, are creating a fundamentally different environment for our intelligence agencies. And they have to adapt in some pretty transformative ways if they want to continue to deliver decision advantage to policymakers. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to, Steve, your questions and the conversation with everybody here.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zegart. That was terrific and exactly what we needed. I want to take off and ask a couple of questions based on some of the things you said, and then maybe introduce a few a few new topics. You certainly described a daunting set of challenges, technological and otherwise, that confront our intelligence agencies. I guess my first question would be whether the agencies are currently sound enough, healthy enough to take on these changes based on what they've been through. So your book acknowledges that the intelligence community was severely tested during the presidency of Donald Trump. The leaders and the professional workforce were publicly ridiculed. Partisans that were installed in senior positions tried to shape analytic judgments to please their leader rather than pursue the truth. Intelligence was apparently, we're learning, tasked to support a challenge to a domestic election, which is unheard of in our system of government and our way of thinking about intelligence. And finally, now just last week, we're learning that sensitive sources and collection methods may have been endangered through careless handling of documents. You know, the most simple and basic fundamentals that undergird sound intelligence work. So I guess my question for you is how do you judge the overall health of our intelligence enterprise? Are they on sound footing to tackle these challenges you pose, or do they need some normalcy or some healing right now?
Thanks for that softball opening question, Professor Slick. You know, I look at the intelligence community from the outside. So I'll give you my outsider's view. But I think it's important to stress that, you know, what's the health of our intelligence community today after the difficulties of the Trump administration, which you ticked down so well. That's something that's really hard to get at from the outside. So I want to, you know, plead for a little humility here, since I'm coming from the outside. But I think there are two different drivers that we need to think about with respect to assessing the health of the intelligence community. The first is more of a macro one. After 20 years of fighting the global war on terror, how well positioned are we to now pivot to dealing with the intelligence challenges of great power competition and other state-based threats? And I think that there's a good news, bad news story there, right? That we got much more adept at dealing with intelligence related to counterterrorism. As one former senior intelligence official told me, you know, his great worry after 9/11 was, by the time we master the Al-Qaeda problem, will Al-Qaeda be the problem? And I think he was right. And so I think we got very good at that tight integration of military and intelligence. But what did that do? It meant that the agency in particular has been devoting a lot more resources, oxygen, time, attention to that more tactical on the battlefield type of intelligence integration. And what's it not able to spend as much time doing? Preventing strategic surprise, looking over the horizon. So Director Burns, as you know well, stood up a China Mission Center when he came into the directorship, and that's a welcome change. But imagine if we had had a China Mission Center earlier, how much more focus we could have had. And so I think there's an opportunity cost. I understand the need to deal with the global war on terror, but there's an adaptation challenge there, just reorienting it after 20 years of fighting a different enemy. So that's sort of the macro challenge. And then there's the political challenge of coming off 4 years of an unorthodox administration that got at the foundational professional ethos of intelligence and really undermined faith in the intelligence community. You know, I try to be an equal opportunity critic when it comes to foreign policy, but the Trump administration dealt with the intelligence community like the marketing department of a corporation trying to sell something, whether it was true or not, and undermined, I think, that professional, nonpartisan view of what intelligence should be, what it must be. How are we doing now? What I'm hearing is that things are getting more back to normal. You see this with DNI Haynes, and you see this with Director Burns, really working hard to reestablish those really important professional norms and communicate them to the outside world. It's not enough to have them internally, you have to communicate them to policymakers. So I think better than where the intelligence community was, but I think there's more repair work to do. Thanks
for that, Dr. Zegart. We appreciate that the optimistic view. I want to pull out one of the ongoing activities that you identified there, and maybe we can hone in on it a little bit more in some more detail. That's the issue of setting priorities, and this calls upon your own expertise at examining organizations and institutions and trying to lead change in them. And so in our system, unlike many other intelligence and security systems in the world, the priorities of the practitioners are set by the policymakers, right? They decide what's important to them, what they want to know more about, and where they would like to spend their scarce intelligence resources. And we're in the midst, as you referred to, of a significant, maybe unprecedented shift in priorities, as you describe, after several decades of doing, not exclusively, but to a high degree of specialization, counterterrorism operations. Now we've asked our intelligence community to focus on support for a longstanding peer competition with the Chinese, possibly with the Russians, with other disruptive states. And so when we talk to our undergraduates in class about the history of US intelligence, we talk about change and significant changes that the community's undergone. And in almost every case we can think of, this was precipitated by disaster, by a significant failure. So the 1947 National Security Act, the CIA itself, very much grounded in the experience at Pearl Harbor and President Truman's interest in not repeating that. The Intelligence Reform Bill in 2004, the IRTPA, was very much the product of an examination of what went wrong on 9/11, what allowed our homeland to be attacked successfully by a group of foreign terrorists, right? So the history is it takes a crisis before US intelligence conducts an effective or comprehensive change. So how confident are you that now that we have new leaders, we have an established system for setting intelligence priorities, that our political and intelligence leaders can change course, can change direction, dial back the amount of resources directed at counterterrorism activity while ramping up focus on China and other targets that we think will be more serious in the future? So do you think this is likely to succeed, or do you think that we're going to experience frustration and we'll have to fail again before we experience change?
Well, Steve, I'm at heart an optimist, so I'd like to think that it doesn't require a failure for us to change fast enough, but I'm worried that it might. And I look at two main challenges, right? One is China, where if you have a conversation in Washington, there seems to be increasing bipartisan alignment about the nature, magnitude, imminence of the China challenge. You hear it's across the aisle, but go outside of Washington, not so much. So here in Silicon Valley, China's still a market. China is still, a source of talent. China, and that's true, to be sure. But I don't think there is the same level of public concern about the nature of the China threat. And you see policymakers trying to influence that public image. Director Wray, FBI Director Chris Wray, with a major speech singling out China just a couple of weeks ago. So I am worried that, in Washington, there's concern about China, but it hasn't resonated across the American populace. And then there's a second threat that worries me more. And that is, are we well organized to deal with cyber threats? So it feels to me the organizational landscape in intelligence as well as in policy is a pre-9/11 kind of counterterrorism landscape. Yes, there are pockets of activity. Yes, there are some people whose hair is on fire, but the government as a whole is very poorly organized to deal with cyber challenges. Who protects us in cyberspace if you're in .com? Who's going to make sure that we're responding in a systematic and helpful fashion? We see increasing efforts. I think the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for Ann Neuberger's role, Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. We see CISA and the Department of Homeland Security playing a bigger role, but we're still in embryonic phases organizationally. So if you look at the number of people dealing with the front lines of cyber challenges in that crucial organization in DHS, we have 10 times the number of people protecting national parks in the United States than our critical cyber infrastructure working in the US government. So I worry much more about the coordination challenges and our organizational misalignment for the cyber threat right now than just about anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Zegart. I'm sure I agree with you on that. And maybe we'll circle back to some of the specific challenges posed by cyber actors, malign cyber actors out there. I want to return to something that you talk about a lot in the book, and I know in your course, and we do as well. And that's the issue of democratic legitimacy, right, for our secret intelligence agencies. So one of the obstacles to democratic accountability that you describe in the book is the government's tendency towards excessive secrecy and overclassification of defense information. And a couple of weeks ago, I know we both noticed the media was reporting on a letter from the Director of National Intelligence to several members of the Congress, where she appears to have acknowledged the problem and made a commitment to greater transparency, and also taking significant steps to prevent overclassification, right? And so pulling the camera way back on our intelligence community and understanding the tensions created by doing secret intelligence work in an open, transparent form of government, it seems to me that we're going the wrong direction with excessive secrecy and overclassification if our intelligence agencies hope to ultimately win the trust, the knowledgeable trust, informed consent of the American people. Where do you see this? Are you optimistic or pessimistic with respect to the government's ability, given all the other things that they're doing right now, to be more careful about what they classify and be more transparent and open in what they share and explain to the US people?
I think it's a tough challenge. I think, overclassification, as you know, has been around and people have complained about it for decades now. So D&I Haynes is in good company, identifying overclassification as a major problem, not just when it comes to garnering the trust of the American people, but enhancing the effectiveness of the intelligence community. Because you've lived this, Professor Slick, when information is overclassified, it gets marooned in different parts of the bureaucracy. And that means we don't know what we know. And that's a challenge, and it hurts our intelligence system as well as our policymakers. So it's not just about trust, although that's incredibly important. It's also about efficacy. How well are we going to do at having a new, more forward-leaning declassification era in intelligence? I'm not so optimistic about that. And for basic bureaucratic reasons, right? Bureaucrats always get rewarded for, or I should say never get penalized for classifying too much. They get penalized for releasing too much. And so in the book, I actually recount a story of how I had an agency team come and do a simulation for my class back when I was teaching at UCLA with Dean Teixeira. And they did a wonderful job with the simulation. They came with a public affairs officer. And this is an outreach visit, right, to UCLA. And the public affairs officer would not tell me his last name and would not give me his business card. This is public affairs, right? This is the job of public affairs, is to be public. So it's just a very telling indicator of how much secrecy is ingrained in the ethos, in the DNA, and the standard operating procedures of the intelligence community. That's a lot to fight to get overclassification, to tackle overclassification. So I think when you're dealing with going up against bureaucratic culture, bureaucratic norms, bureaucratic incentives, right, that's a tough thing. So I'm not so optimistic about that, but it's certainly something that we need to pay attention to. And I'm glad the Director of National Intelligence is focused on it.
Yeah, thank you. I think I share your pessimism on the ultimate outcome of this dialogue, but it is positive and constructive to hear that the intelligence leaders are thinking about it, understand the problems it poses, and understand that ultimately the more they're able to talk about what they do and who they are and the way they go about their business, the greater support they're going to enjoy amongst the American people. And no democratic institution can survive long without that informed consent, that knowledge and support of the American people. I want to turn now a little bit, change of course, back to something else I know you've thought and written about extensively, and that's the issue of public-private relationships. I guess I have in my notes partnerships, but that may be too optimistic an assessment. So, I mean, the windup is simple. Through the decades of the Cold War, right, the competition with the Soviet Union over many decades, U.S. intelligence enjoyed, in fact, relied on the full cooperation of the American business sector, particularly the high-tech sector. So that Cold War has been over for 30 years now, and the government has a much more complicated relationship with today's private sector. In fact, the large social media firms whose global platforms are being exploited by terrorists, criminals, foreign security services are not particularly interested in having close or at least openly acknowledged relationships with the government. So you live and work in the heart of the Silicon Valley. You know people on both sides of this divide. What would you see as a way forward to start developing trust and ultimately sharing of information and, dare I say, cooperation, partnership ultimately with the government on shared objectives, like keeping our country safe, like keeping citizens' data safe from penetration? They do have a lot in common, but how are they going to find this, and how are we going to go forward on this?
This is an issue I have been really concerned about for a long time. So I'll share with this crowd. So shortly after the Snowden revelation, so former NSA contractor Ed Snowden, right, illegally reveals all this information about our classified intelligence programs, including those of the NSA. So within a year of that, I co-sponsored with my colleague here, Herb Lynn, a congressional cyber boot camp. So we brought members, staffers from Congress, both parties, both houses to Silicon Valley. And we wanted to start to try to repair that, educate them and try to repair that trust deficit. And we went to a major tech company, and a senior executive at the tech company pointed to the staffers in the room. And he said, I want you to know, I view you just like I do the People's Liberation Army of China. You are adversaries trying to get into my systems, and I'm going to try to keep you from penetrating them. And this was a jaw-dropping moment for us. And several of the staffers ran outside and started calling the members of Congress saying, we have a lot of work here to do. This was the lowest moment of distrust, I think, between Silicon Valley and the US government, the intelligence community, the Defense Department. From the perspective of businesses here, it's all the same, right? Congress, NSA, it's all the same. So that said, I think things have gotten better from that very low point, but we have a long way to go. And one of the things that I've been doing with colleagues at Hoover, H.R. McMaster and others, is we've been hosting a Tech Track 2 dialogue. As I like to say, we need suits and hoodies to speak the same language. And the way that we can get the suits and the hoodies to speak the same language is to get them together in off-the-record conversations without cameras rolling, so they can forge those kind of better trusted relationships, hopefully partnerships, but getting to those really candid and difficult conversations. We've had 3 of these Tech Track 2 discussions. We intend to have more of them. I see some progress with respect to, sometimes the temperature gets a little high, but I think there's greater understanding. And I will share, Steve, something that I've noticed, which is the language that different people use matters. So DoD people in particular like to come to the Valley and they use D words: defeat, destroy, degrade, domain, dominate. People in the Valley like to use C words: create, collaborate, change. It is a different orientation, and part of that partnership really requires understanding the 2 very different cultures. Now, I'm not naive. There are different incentives, as you allude to in the question, right? These companies have global markets, global shareholders, global employees, and their interests are not perfectly aligned with national security. But we have to be able to do better. And we have to be able to have companies not say things like, we don't want to be involved in making anything related to a weapon, when in fact their platform is a weapon. It is a weapon for cyber attacks. It is a weapon for information warfare. It's just naive to think that it's not. So we have to do better, but I'm encouraged that I think compared to where we were in 2014, we're improving.
Well, thanks for that. I appreciate the optimism and your efforts to build bridges and increase contact time is invariably a good idea and helpful, but it is very much, it seems to me, an institutional tension that exists between these 2 communities. And they're not going to be the best companies they can be, and we're not going to be the best national security establishment we can be until we find some way of living together, at least on important goals like maintaining the integrity of our elections and matters that both parties can easily see in their interest.
But I would just add something else, because I think this actually gets back to the important work that you're doing and others are doing in education. Tech leaders today, one of the things that strikes me is how many tech leaders today think they don't need to worry about national security. So we need to be educating the tech leaders of tomorrow to understand how important national security is. So, and that's, you know, the Mark Zuckerbergs of tomorrow need to come out of UT, right? They need to take your classes. They need to understand that the world isn't safe and secure by accident, that it requires real work by the government to make free markets and free peoples and free societies. So I think that education function at the college level is incredibly important for long-term collaboration between the tech sector and the government.
I agree with you, and I appreciate the plug for our new concept of STEM and national security for undergraduates here at the University of Texas. I want to turn to questions. I have another several sheets of paper of matters that interest me, but we'll have a chance to talk offline. We have some great questions here from some distinguished questioners, and in that regard, we're both well acquainted and in the debt of David Omond, one of our colleagues from the United Kingdom, former director of the GCHQ, their signals intelligence organization. And Sir David asked, do your technology-driven 5 mores challenge the very existence of the separate agencies? Or do we end up like the separate armed services are today, invaluable for recruiting, the initial training and morale, but the planning and execution of operations must be conducted by joint commands backed by joint supporting commands? So this is obviously a question directed at the longstanding federated nature of our intelligence community, right? Agencies embedded in 6 different cabinet departments and cooperating when and as they see fit on activities. What do you think of Sir David's suggestion?
I think it's a really intriguing suggestion. I don't know how we get from here to there. I mean, it took 40 years for us to get to the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. It took, as you pointed out earlier, a number of failures in order to get there. But I think Sir David's question is onto something so important, which is that the system that we have is divided largely by customer and by type of intelligence. And that's less relevant today, where we have to have all source intelligence really and be able to deliver it in a way that is more effective for policymakers. But I'd add something else to it, and I'd be curious to know his reaction as well, which is that no secret agency is going to give open source intelligence the attention that it deserves. And so not only do we need to figure out a better organizational structure to get information better stitched together for policymakers, but how do we ensure that we have the attention, the focus, the resources, the talent dedicated to tradecraft and collection of open source intelligence? And so I have advocated, and we can arm wrestle about this, so you may have a different view. I've advocated that the need for a separate open source intelligence agency, precisely because I think we're not going to get the focus that we need in open source with the existing structure. But I would argue there are 2 other reasons why we need an open source agency. The first is we have to harness new technological tools to analyze data. And it's easier to do that if your test bed is unclassified information. You can experiment more readily, more easily, more transparently if you're working in the unclassified world. And the second reason is the talent piece, right? At the end of the day, it's about talent. And you have to be able to attract technological talent. And you can do that better when you can, number 1, talk about what you're doing, and number 2, forward deploy your agency to where people want to live, right? So you're not just inside the Beltway, but imagine open source agency offices in places like Austin or Palo Alto or Denver or Seattle or other places around the country. So I think it is an enabler if you had an open source agency for technological innovation and talent recruitment, not just the collection and analysis of open source.
Thanks for that, Dr. Zegart. And I think you know already we're in violent agreement on the need for possible restructuring and reorganization to better address the open source challenges in Washington. Let me just ask you to play that out a little bit further, because I think it's tremendously important for the next steps that our intelligence community is required to take, and in particular dealing with this volume of data that we're all experiencing. You're familiar with the history and the research of this, that the challenge being to identify the insightful signals from amongst the cacophony of noise out there, not meaning to denigrate necessarily people's social conversations, but there's a lot of noise and not a lot of insight, and we're having a hard time separating the two. Why would you place such an organization outside the intelligence community, or what's your thinking in proposing that? Whereas if you were able to encourage the intelligence community to invest more resources, raise the priority level for open source, either as a separate agency or within each of the constituent agencies, you could ensure that it would be integrated fully into the nation's intelligence work. Where if it were left outside the 18 agency intelligence community, you would have a new set of relationships to deal with, a separate and open and unclassified entity doing all the tasks that you described, and some question of whether the intelligence community would accept their products, cooperate with them fully, or whether they would simply, reinvent an open source mechanism within their own institutional walls. That's a rambling question, but I just invite you to put some meat on those bones and tell us what it might look like, how it would function.
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. So I should clarify. I think a new open source agency should be a 19th element of the U.S. intelligence community for the reasons you described. So if we look across, where do you want to concentrate open source capabilities? It's not either or. You have to have existing agencies dealing in open source as well, which they are, but I don't think not enough. So then the question is, if you think we need a new dedicated capability, where should it reside? Well, I was a part of the CSIS task force looking at artificial intelligence and the future of the intelligence community. We grappled with this a little bit. And we ended up coming down agnostic on where it should reside. I'm not so agnostic on where it should reside. So we looked at the State Department. I think the State Department is very good at doing, what the State Department does is actually work in open source intelligence. That's what diplomats do. But I think that can be problematic. It could be too easily shoved aside as, oh, that's just the State Department doing the State Department's thing. You could be in the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, but the ODNI should be focused on coordination, not having its own dogs in the collection and analysis fight. And so I think an independent agency that doesn't report to a cabinet secretary, so it's not part of the Defense Department, but an independent agency is the best option that we have. Now, I recognize that no solution is perfect. And I have in my previous work, I'm sure if I don't say this, you're going to say this. In my previous work, I've talked about coordination challenges in intelligence. So how can I recommend another agency if I think coordination challenges are so problematic? And I think it's a risk reward situation. I think the benefits to open source are so great that we should incur the coordination costs of adding another element to the intelligence community.
And thank you for that. And I would only add that whatever challenges you expect to be created by this, I think many of us would agree that the current status of open source, both structurally and substantively within the community is probably not the right answer. It's not receiving the attention and the priority it deserves. And so some change of some nature is overdue.
I just add one other thing, because you've raised another issue, which is that open source intelligence, I think, isn't just stuff. Open source intelligence needs to be thought of as an organizational ecosystem. And so when we look at the organizations and individuals that are in this world, we have to have the capacity in the US government to shape that ecosystem, to affect its dynamics, to have guardrails of the ecosystem, to affect quality control, to understand how it could be manipulated, how it goes awry. So it's not enough just to say, we need more of that open source stuff. Let's mix it and stir. We have to think about the open source capability as a capability of engaging with and shaping the open source ecosystem of intelligence. And that's another reason why I think it's really important to have a separate agency that's that node of engagement.
Thank you. That's well said. I need to turn back to my audience. The stack of question cards is growing here. Here's a question from one of our participants today, Peter Park. You opened noting that the paucity of Intel experience on the oversight committees. Those same committees began life as a deeply and truly nonpartisan entities. What do you see in the future role for the SISI, and that's the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the HPSI, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, in shaping the agencies? So what kind of assessment, what kind of score would you give the congressional oversight committees based on the current work they're doing?
Well, I think there are always some members of those committees that really spend a great deal of time and care a great deal about oversight. But overall, the committees have done a poor job. And overall, members of Congress have very little incentive to focus on oversight and devote the time and attention they need. That said, as you know, as observers, other than, I mean, many people have noted this, the Senate is invariably less partisan than the House. Now, there are structural reasons for that, right? The terms are longer, the committees are structured differently. There's not such a wide disparity between the majority and the minority members, right? There's a much slimmer difference in the Senate by Senate rules than the House. There aren't term limits for membership on the Senate committee now. There still are in the House. So I'm much more optimistic about the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I'd note that, you know, even in this highly polarized moment, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has delivered, I think, quite a good bipartisan series of reports on Russia's election interference efforts in 2016. I think they don't get enough credit for that. That was a remarkable investigation. They did it on a bipartisan basis at a very difficult time. So I think bipartisanship is by no means dead on the SISI, and I think we see that. I think they're working pretty hard, but it's becoming more of a challenge. On the House side, I think the House committee has been mired in partisanship. It did not help in the Trump administration. And if they could do one thing tomorrow, if I could wave my wand and ask the HPSI to do one thing tomorrow, it would be eliminate term limits on that committee. Because just when members understand what they're doing and how the intelligence community operates, they are term limited and have to roll off that committee. That makes no sense to me in the modern era. I understand the reason for it, which was to prevent them from getting too cozy with the agencies they were overseeing. But that rationale has outlived its usefulness.
Thank you for that. That's well said. You mentioned and gave credit to the Senate committee for its largely bipartisan 5-volume report on Russian election interference in 2016. That, of course, my students will know from our policy research project on foreign election interference. That was sort of a seminal piece of work and very important for the country at the time to have a set of facts from which we could have policy discussions in the future about how to prevent a recurrence of a foreign government interfering in our elections. And so I agree with you. It was terrific work and very selfless and seriously done. In that regard, we have one of our fine students, a Brumley Fellow, Alex Rose, who says, what can the US intel agencies do, if anything, to combat disinformation campaigns launched by our adversaries? And I think this may be an example of an area, as you described earlier, a sub category of cyber threats where we may not be as well organized as we should be. Certainly the intelligence community will have a role to play. What would you think that role is that doesn't overlap or interfere with the role of the private sector, the role of the Department of Homeland Security, the White House, the Congress, and other actors? What's the IC's distinctive role in managing the integrity of our systems or keeping our elections fair?
Oh, it's such a good and hard question to answer. I think the IC's distinctive role has got to be, as it has been in the past, providing strategic warning. So better understanding how information warfare campaigns start, how they operate, how do we know them when we see them? So I think one of the, there's been a lot written and declassified about 2016 and Russia's information warfare campaign. The one part of that campaign that the IC did not see coming was not in that intelligence assessment that was made public. The one part they really didn't see coming was the use of Facebook and other social media. How did the US government know about those fraudulent Facebook accounts where internet trolls in St. Petersburg were masquerading as Americans? They knew from Facebook, right? So if we're relying on Facebook to let us know and to provide early warning, we're in trouble, right? So we need to have, back to the conversation about better partnerships, the distinctive role of the intelligence community is to work hand in hand to anticipate and identify these things before it's too late. I think, though, we're seeing something playing out. I'd be curious to know your assessment of this, Steve. We're seeing the forewarning, the publicizing of Russian false flag operations right now playing out with Russia and Ukraine, the release of intelligence with the Russian plans to stage a phony video of Ukrainian atrocities. And that's to combat information warfare, right? That may or may not affect Vladimir Putin's incentives to attack, but it certainly takes the wind out of the sails of an information warfare campaign, because it's a lot harder to buy the false narrative when it's singled out as false before you ever hear the narrative, right? Once the narrative is in the wild, we know from psychology research, it's hard to combat the beliefs that you have once you believe something. So if the first narrative out of the gate is, be careful because they're peddling this phony video with corpses and actors, right? Now people are inoculated more against information warfare. So I think this is a very interesting strategy that the Biden administration is using right now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amy. We'll probably have to leave it there. When we were talking a little earlier today, I told you I actually think it's a quite appropriate use, maybe even clever on the part of the administration to use intelligence and other information to disrupt some of the information operations that President Putin and the Russian government are trying to wrap around whatever their ultimate aim is here in Ukraine. There are clearly some hazards involved. We like to protect our sensitive sources and our fragile collection methods, but the fact of the matter is we collect that information for a reason, and that's to support US policy and US interests overseas. And if the administration has taken a sober look at this and say, we think we can use this information, we think it might be helpful in destabilizing the Russians in the days before they act in Ukraine, and we can do it at an acceptable cost in terms of future collection. I think that sounds to me like good government, and I know you agree.
I guess the question there is, how do you judge success? So one concern I have is, let's say the Russians do invade Ukraine. I worry that will be considered an intelligence failure on the part of releasing this information. Why wasn't the release of this information enough to stop him? And I think that's wrong, right? So the question of success and failure is, did the Russians even try to create this false flag operation as a pretext for invasion? And if they did it stick? And so if they didn't do it, that could be a win for intelligence. And if it didn't stick, that should be a win for intelligence, even if troops invade. But I don't think that's going to be the narrative if that ends up coming to pass.
I'll resist the opportunity to rehash that old saw about only two things in Washington, first being policy successes or alternatively intelligence failures. In any event, we're going to have to wrap it up here. Professor Zegart, thank you very much for spending time with us today. I highly recommend to our participants on our webinar today, the new book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, available wherever fine books are sold. I received one from the publisher and one from Amazon, and I treasure both of them and look forward to getting them signed in person. So thanks very much, Professor Zegart. We appreciate your time and your insights.
Thanks so much, Professor Slick, for having me.